So let's talk about promises. So a promise is a structure that allows you to avoid writing code that gets into a so-called callback hell. And a callback hell is basically, imagine that you're doing some type of AJAX request, and then when the response comes back from the server, you want to do something with that data, and then you want to send something else to the server, and you can do that multiple times, right? The problem with that is that that means that you need to chain callbacks. So you put a callback for the response, the first response, and then you need make another request, and then that needs a callback, and then you do another one, and that needs a callback. You start chaining callbacks, and you get into so-called callback hell. And Promises solves that problem for you. So what you do is that you create a promise, you give it a function, that function takes a resolve and a reject callback, and if your asynchronous operation, which is what you're firing inside of the promise, succeeds, you use the resolve callback to indicate that, right, my execution succeeded, I'll give you back this value, and then I'm done, right? So you resolve the value, and if it fails, you do a reject with some value. You don't have to give it a value, but in this case, we are giving it a value. And that's the basics of how a promise actually works. Right, so let's step through how a promise will work. Now, you create the promise, you do a resolve and a reject, and then you do some computation. It can be an asynchronous thing. All that's important is that you call the resolve function, and when that's done, you will return a new promise, so then you can actually use a .then function. The resolve is returning this value wrapped in another promise, and that takes a callback which will provide the value, so these two are equal, and in this case we just return the value, we don't do anything magical with it, and then we have another .then function, and then we just log out the value. So if I copy paste this now, and I go to my browser, and I click and I do this, yeah, right, so we can see now that we logged out the value. So what's happened is that we start off here, we return something, and then we go down to the next step, and then the next step, and I can just keep on chaining forever and forever and forever. And each step of this execution will happen in a synchronous manner. So if I did a AJAX call at the top, I would be guaranteed that none of this other stuff would run until that AJAX call was done. That's the power of promises. You can do it in the same way for rejections. There's a bit of a difference though. So let's say that something goes wrong and I reject some step of the execution. Then I will actually not hit the next .then function. I will actually hit the catch function. And you have to declare this. In the previous example, we didn't have a .catch, so if something fails up here, it will actually just log out an error, it will throw an error rather, and here we handle that error. So if I copy paste this stuff now, I go back, I paste it in, this is my error, that's what's being logged out. Even though there's a .then afterwards, we skip all that and go down to the catch. And yeah, this is pretty much how you will use your promises most of the time. One common thing you will find that you're going to use promises for is to do AJAX calls or other asynchronous stuff, and for the most part you're just going to do one of those at a given time. However, sometimes you want to be able to do multiple promises at the same time or in parallel, which allows you to basically run your code faster. You're going to be able to actually do a lot of work at the same time, as I said, in parallel. However, the problem there is that since these are async operations, you don't know when they're finished. So let's say that you had multiple promises and you wanted to make sure that you don't do any of the stuff with your logic, that the rest of the code doesn't run until all of them are done. So to do that, you will do promise.all. So this is an example. So we create an array of promises. We loop through a loop here, and in this scenario we make a very simple structure. We create a promise, and all it's going to do is it's going to resolve to whatever I is. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. You get the drift. And then we add that promise to our promises array, because remember, promises are just objects that hold some computation, and when they're finished, well, they can be finished at any given time. They're not synchronous, so we have to remind ourselves of that. And then we do this, so promise.all, and then we give it an array of promises. So what's going to happen is that promise.all is going to take that array, and it's going to wait until all of the promises are done, and then it's going to go over to the next.then function, and then it's going to log out these values. So let's copy paste this, go to the browser, paste that in, and as you can see, so these are my values, 1, 2, 3, yeah, you can see. So that's the magic and the power of promise.all, and you are going to use this quite a bit when you start doing more complicated things with promises.